be seated. Today is the Feast of the Transfiguration. It brings to a close the season of Epiphany, which began all the way back just after Christmas with the coming of the wise men. But the Feast of the Transfiguration is more than just, more than the end of a season. And yes, it moves us from Epiphany to Lent, but not before this day and all that it means. This day is a hinge, a pivot, vitally important to the story. Everything that came before it, from the birth of Jesus to his baptism, to his teaching in Galilee, to Peter's confession that Jesus was the Christ, all of that has its climax in the Transfiguration. So all that had come before, then the day itself, and then the day after, all of that is of a piece. It was, the day itself was a full day. Jesus invites the inner circle of Peter and James and John to go hiking with him. Just a little hike up to the top of Mount Tabor. Less than 2,000 feet high. It wouldn't take long. It wouldn't be difficult. But they went there to pray. But when they got there, up there, the apostles were now sleepy. And they were dozing, certainly not attending to their prayers. Then, while the apostles were dozing, then the Transfiguration miracle begins. And the appearance of Jesus' face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white, illuminating who he was. Suddenly, the apostles were roused from their half-waking naps, and they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking with Jesus. And then, just then, the apostles began to understand, however dimly, they began to understand his divine nature. And as the gospel said, they, that is, Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure. The word is actually in Greek, his exodus, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. And you know the story. A cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified, and they entered the cloud. Then, from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." Then, the voice, as it had spoken, after that, Jesus was found alone. And in a day of surprises, we get one more. Luke tells us that in spite of all of that has happened, they kept silent, and in those days told no one of what they had seen. It's remarkable. With the exception, I think, of the Nativity, the Transfiguration is the most important miracle to date, at least in my opinion. Peter, James, and John failed to understand the importance of the manifestation of Moses and Elijah and their exchange with Jesus as a sign that the Christ had come in fulfillment of the law and the prophets. By his transfiguration, Jesus recapitulates everything that had come before him and anticipates his passion and his death. And yet, this is only half of the story. We can be forgiven for thinking that this is the whole story because it's a lot and it's important. But it is not the rest of the story when it comes to the Transfiguration. The story continues, and it is a mistake that we don't have the full reading printed today. The lectionary includes verses 37 to 43, but only parenthetically, only as a suggestion. What happens, though, in those additional verses is vitally important to understanding the Transfiguration story. The next day, Jesus and the three disciples are back down from the mount, from their little hike. They have rejoined the other apostles. Just then, a great crowd met them, and a man approached Jesus and said, really, he screamed, "Teacher, I beg you, look at my son. He's my only son." Suddenly, a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth. And this word is really important. It mauls him, and can scarcely leave him. He says to Jesus, "I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not." Now the words in the story say that the disciples could not help, but I prefer the words would not help. Remember your Bible, and not from a different book in the Bible, but from Luke, and not from a different chapter, but from chapter 9, the very chapter and verses just before the Transfiguration. It says, when Jesus had called the 12 together, he gave them power and authority to drive out all demons and to cure diseases, to heal the sick. That just happened. Then today, they either refused to help because their hearts were hard, or they had a crisis of faith maybe and couldn't help. Either way, a boy and his father were profoundly suffering. And so Jesus was angry at his disciples. He says, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you?" That's hard and harsh to hear Jesus talking about. But if we think that Jesus is talking to the disciples who were there at the time only, well, then we are like children watching a sibling get in trouble, thinking that we are not also in trouble. Right? We disciples now and then are expected to do something to alleviate suffering. Thankfully, for the boy in this story and for countless other people suffering, then and now, Jesus has mercy and love. He says to the man, "Bring your son here." And Jesus rebukes the unclean spirit, and he heals the boy and gives him back to his father. And this is precisely why we need both parts of the Transfiguration story, the part up and the part down. A Lutheran theologian that I read this week, called Lori Hale, put it this way. She said, the story of the Transfiguration of Jesus loses its power if it does not include that moment when Jesus and the disciples come down from the mountain. You see, the transfigured Jesus is changed not in his essence, but in the way that he is seen by others. See, seeing Jesus differently means seeing oneself and others differently as well. Another theologian, this time a Methodist, I'm being downright ecumenical today. Her name is Sharon Ring. She wrote, "In the Transfiguration, glory meets suffering. The glory of God's presence and the pain of a broken world cannot be separated. Otherwise, the Transfiguration is just a magic show. A cool magic show, to be sure, but of what lasting import for you and for me? The Transfiguration must be more than a miracle, however profound. It must mean something for people who are suffering. Look to the boy and his father. Look to those who are mauled by addiction. Look to people who are mauled by mental illness, mauled by racism, mauled by domestic violence and human trafficking, people who are beaten by poverty, assaulted by a lack of hope, chewed on by loneliness. The Transfiguration of Jesus offers a hint of what is possible, not only for Jesus, but for all of humanity. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, they're all wrapped up in the Transfiguration. What he was accomplishing was his death, so that all could live forever. The law and the prophets were being fulfilled so that he could give life to all, and so that we could also give life to others in his name. Jesus went up there to pray with his disciples and to teach his disciples, not with his words, but with a miracle. Then he went down. He had to show them again what they were supposed to be doing: healing, loving, forgiving. So go to the mountain from time to time. Pray see the glory of God for yourself and be renewed by his glory. And then go back down into the world, for the world, and for those who are suffering without our help. Jesus and the 3 disciples leave the mountaintop for everyday reality. We must do the same every day. For that is where true transfiguration happens. And it starts with you and Jesus going for a little hike. Amen.